So this presentation is Sweet QuaDreams or Nightmare Before Christmas, Dissecting an iOS O-Day. And just before we get started, I don't mean to disappoint you, but we're talking about an older attack, so we're not dropping any CVEs on stage. And as part of responsible disclosure that we like to participate in, we have shared all of the technical details with Apple. So unfortunately, you can no longer take advantage of this vulnerability. So my name is Christine Fossaceca. I'm a senior security researcher at Microsoft. I've contributed to a bunch of different projects during my time there. So primarily I worked on mobile reverse engineering, including creating features for the Defender for iOS app. I also have contributed to our file analyzer product, which is in Security Copilot, and I reverse engineer iOS malware with Mystic. Also, if you get a chance, please check out my podcast, Her Hacks Podcast, which is a podcast by women in cybersecurity for everyone.
Very cool. So I am Bill Marczak. I'm a researcher at CitizenLab, based at the University of Toronto, although I myself am in California. You might be familiar with some of CitizenLab's reports. We have a number of different research streams. So the research stream that I'm a part of is called Targeted Threats. And we publish reports looking at, for instance, what we call the mercenary spyware industry. So companies like NSO Group and Pegasus Spyware, Citrox, Intellexa, and the Predator Spyware, Candaroo. There's a bunch of companies in the industry, which we'll talk about a little later. So I'm a computer scientist by training, but I do want to give a plug for a couple recent reports that we came out with at CitizenLab, which sort of show a little bit of the other research streams we have going. So we recently released a report looking at digital transnational repression, specifically focusing on the gender dimensions of it. So activists who have fled to other countries in the diaspora, getting targeted by their home governments online and in person. And we just released a report today, actually, looking at some interesting spyware, not necessarily technically sophisticated, but still nevertheless interesting from the Russian FSB. So definitely check those out. But back to the sort of stuff that I do, which is looking at targeted spyware and things like Pegasus. You've probably heard of them. Spyware to target your phone. So if you want to target someone's phone, right, someone's iPhone, let's say, with spyware, how do you do it? Well, the first instance of this we uncovered was actually back in 2016, where an activist in the United Arab Emirates, Ahmed Mansour, received this text message, which basically promises new secrets about torture of Emiratis in state prisons in the UAE. And if he had clicked on this, it would have delivered a chain of WebKit exploits. WebKit is sort of a target where there's a perennial, always some CVE going where you can, get RCE and do privilege escalation from WebKit. So not necessarily super novel, but it was interesting. We were able to capture the exploits and the spyware back in 2016. This was, of course, Pegasus. But since then, threat actors have been getting a little bit more sophisticated in terms of getting initial access. So of course, yeah, you can take advantage of the exploit of the week in WebKit, or you can do something a little bit stealthier, which is what we call zero-click exploits. And you've probably seen a few examples of this in the reporting. Probably the best known example is 2021-30860, which we called forced entry. So this was the Turing machine in a PDF exploit. Google Project Zero did a fantastic write-up about this you should check out. And then in 2023, there were a couple that were disclosed. Of course, the WebP 0 day, which was an issue with WebP parsing, which was used again via iMessage attachments to deliver a malicious payload. And then, of course, 2023 41990, the font parser issue, which was released by Kaspersky Lab in their Operation Triangulation report, which was said to be sort of a US Five Eyes type operation there.
All right, so we would like... Hello? Okay. So before we move any further, we want to level set a little bit because you've probably been hearing us say 0 day and 0 click, and they are slightly different. So just to give you a formal definition, a 0 day is an exploited vulnerability for which there is no patch available at the time which it is seen in the wild. A 0 click, on the other hand, is a remote vulnerability that requires no user interaction or clicks. So the 3 CVEs that Bill just talked about were examples of both the 0 days and 0 clicks because, again, it required no user interaction. So the malicious payload was delivered to the end user device, and the phone in some way automatically parsed that payload without the user even knowing about it. So today we are going to be talking about both 0-day and 0-click exploit of Icalendar. So iMessage has primarily been the threat surface that threat actors target, and this is because it is a feature-rich attack surface that allows you to send PDFs or send different links or send really any type of payload that is automatically received by your end device, and there's ways to interact with iMessage. So because of that threat surface, Apple decided to crack down and make it more secure by introducing a new feature called BlastDoor.
Yeah, so the history of iOS 0-click exploitation is actually quite interesting. There was a talk by, I forget who it was, someone I believe at Google, Project Zero, looking at the sort of history of 0-click exploitation on iOS. And the sort of way you used to do it, right, is the observation is that iMessages and various things that can be included in them have some sort of complicated serialization format, and there's NS-keyed archives which are de-archived by the receiver, and maybe you can find some bugs in there by playing around with the structure of the message. So Google Project Zero released a report essentially burning a number of interesting techniques here, and we saw threat actors like NSO shift to targeting IM transcoder agent. So this is the component of the iMessage pipeline, which, for instance, will transcode images, generate previews, things like this. So it's running Image IO, which is Apple's kind of, like kitchen sink image parser that parses, even the most obscure junk you can think of, which is actually quite a rich attack surface. So Apple sort of realized this, and that threat actors were going there, and said, okay, we're gonna do BlastDoor. So this is a sandbox that protects not only the parsing of the structure of the iMessage, but also the transcoding of any sort of interesting media within the message. So this sort of created an interesting fork in the road, right? 2 approaches. You could attack or circumvent BlastDoor, right? The old adage, show me a 10-foot sandbox, I'll show you an 11-foot sandbox escape. Or you could kind of go and find a different attack surface. So we saw threat actors like NSO and their Pegasus spyware primarily focusing on the attacking and circumventing of BlastDoor. But the attack that we're going to be talking about today was actually quite interesting because the attackers appear to have found a totally different attack surface, not at all related to iMessage, which was not protected by BlastDoor or indeed any well, I don't want to say any, but not protected by a sandbox of the same caliber as BlastDoor.
So just to give you an overview of our talk, now Bill and I are going to tell you the story about how we discovered that we had something in common in terms of this specific threat actor. So we'll tell you a little bit about the samples that we found, how we correlated them together. Then I'll talk a little bit about the attribution and who that threat actor is. Then Bill and I spent a long time reversing a super annoying Go sample together. So we're going to talk a little bit about how we did that. And we'll talk about the things that we found and what led us to the theory of the exploit and how we think the payload was initially delivered to that device. So going back to this new form of iOS initial access that we had never seen before. So starting with the discovery of the attack and the samples. When you're doing iOS malware RE, you're going to start with one of 2 ways. You either already have a sample like me, so you'll do a top-down analysis. And you'll take that sample, you'll throw it in IDA or Ghidra, and you'll try to understand what that sample does. Then once you get a good understanding of some of the static methods that you think are interesting, you'll try hooking them with Frida, and then see what forensic traces it leaves behind on your test device. Maybe look through the phone's logs and just see, what's been happening and what is this sample actually doing. On the other hand, if you are someone like Bill at CitizenLab, you're going to start with a bottom-up approach. So you're starting with a potentially infected device, and you're looking for implausible artifacts in that device's logs, maybe in the sysdiagnose, or in anything that you see on the device that was touched and maybe should not have been. And so this is how CitizenLab is able to detect unknown spyware.
Yeah, that's a great description, Christine. Thank you. And it's actually interesting because we were both coming at this in this research from different perspectives. Christine was going top down. I was going bottom up. So Christine mentioned this notion of an implausible artifact, and I'll briefly give a couple examples which have been quite fruitful in log analysis on iPhones. So for a while there was this directory. This directory still exists, but it has become somewhat less useful. But it used to be quite useful for threat actors. Private, VeriDB, COM, Apple XPC, role account destaging. You'd often find evidence that attacker binaries were dropped or launched from that directory. Normally used for things like iOS updates or developer mode or things like this. So you can kind of understand that there's a very small number of things that should be legitimately executing from there and flag anything else that's not one of those legitimate things. Also /tmp is another directory that threat actors like because this is wiped on a reboot. And another interesting example, which comes courtesy of Kaspersky Lab and their Operation Triangulation report, they found in devices of Kaspersky researchers that had been attacked with Triangulation's iPhone spyware, that a particular process named backup agent was recorded in the data usage.sqlite file as consuming mobile data. And backup agent is, of course, a legitimate process on iOS. However, it's been subsumed by backup agent 2. So it would be quite a shock to find backup agent legitimately consuming mobile data. So this was a pretty good implausible artifact that they were able to identify. Now, one kind of caveat here, which is that usually the mental model we're bringing to the table is that the attacker is doing something very traditional. They start with an RCE, have a privilege escalation, and ultimately run an attacker binary, like a full-featured spyware payload. But this is not always true. And there's been examples coming up of companies, for instance, Paragon, a competitor to NSO, has recently, I think they launched in 2019, and the approach that they are said to use is to target kind of individual apps rather than the entire system. So you could imagine, if you have an exploit for, let's say, WhatsApp, you would target WhatsApp, get the juice from WhatsApp, but decline to escalate and break out of the WhatsApp sandbox and affect the rest of the system. So there might not be an attacker binary that's actually run, which might make this analysis in some cases a bit less useful. So how do we actually do this analysis? Often CitizenLab, our mandate is to work with civil society, journalists, dissidents, those types of targets. And we offer this sort of log analysis triage service where people can get their phones checked. And one of these checks that we did several years ago showed that multiple phones had run a binary out of this role account destaging directory called subridged. And immediately, we understood this was implausible. This should not have happened, but for the phone being compromised. But furthermore, the phones were negative for Pegasus, right? Pegasus is sort of, if you follow iPhone spyware, it's kind of the Coca-Cola of spyware, right? It's the one everybody's heard of. If you look, you'll find it pretty much anywhere. Not necessarily the first cola or the best cola, but the one you hear about the most. So you think to check, okay, well, was this phone compromised by Pegasus? The answer is no. So this told us we were looking at a new threat actor.
So meanwhile, over at Microsoft, Microsoft Threat Intelligence is always tracking in the wild threats, and we will try to attribute them to the threat actor that we think is behind it using our naming taxonomy. So we actually had found a sample that had that same hard-coded path with COM, Apple, XPC, role account destaging, and that subridged file. So in the spirit of collaboration, which we love to do with our partners, Bill and I got together and decided to try and reverse engineer this exploit together. So now I'm going to tell you a little bit about who this sample came from. So I am not on the Mystic team, so I don't take part in the attribution itself, but I was very lucky that my coworkers were able to tell me, oh, we know who this is. This is Carmine Tsunami. So a tsunami is the Microsoft Threat Intelligence taxonomy name for a PSOA, or a private sector offensive actor. These are companies that sell hacking tools or hacking as a service, often exclusively to governments. However, it is also normally something that is abused, and that's part of that mercenary spyware industry that Bill and CitizenLab track. So in this case, this threat actor was known as QuaDream, which was an Israeli company, competitor to NSO based out of Israel.
Yeah, so what Microsoft refers to as PSOAs, we refer to as sort of the mercenary spyware industry. And companies that you've probably heard of, like NSO Group, Intellexa, maybe some other ones that haven't gotten as much publicity, like Protect Electronic Systems based out of the UAE, Paragon in Israel, QuaDream, and Kandaroo in Israel. Israel for a long time has been a big locus of the industry, though that might be changing now with new export controls and regulations. But one feature of the mercenary spyware industry is that the products that they sell are often abused, right? So the marketing of the products is, well, look, law enforcement agencies, you have suspects that are going dark, you have serious crime, pedophiles, terrorists that you want to go after, you need this spyware to make it happen. But more often than not, we find cases, and not just in one or two countries, but in sometimes countries you don't expect, democracies like Spain or Poland, where the spyware is not used against criminals and terrorists exclusively, but is also used against political opposition or journalists or lawyers or activists or dissidents. And that can sometimes seem a little bit abstract, but there's been actually some really quite tangible cases of abuse where the harms are very clear. So a couple of years ago, the UK High Court, in a fact-finding judgment, found that the Emir of Dubai, Sheikh Mohammed, had spied on his ex-wife in a child custody dispute, as well as her lawyers in the dispute, including a member of the UK House of Lords, Baroness Fiona Shackleton. And this was quite a big news item, and you can sort of see, like someone spying on their ex-wife. It's a pretty clear-cut case where the harms are very clear, especially in an ongoing legal dispute. Now, of course, the mercenary spyware industry isn't the only zero-click game in town. As Kaspersky showed us with the Operation Triangulation report, with the suspected US Five Eyes operation there, and of course, the famous report by Reuters back in 2019 called Project Raven, which looked into a UAE defense contractor working with the UAE government to spy on activists and journalists. So I'll turn it over to Christine to talk about what we found specifically with QuaDream and cases of abuse.
So what we found with this PSOA, or mercenary spyware company, was that QuaDream had some operator locations literally all over the world, in countries like Mexico, Hungary, Uzbekistan, Ghana, Singapore, as well as in Europe. And their victim locations were also all over the world. And so in order to protect those victims, we're only going to refer to them in generalities. So we can say North America, Europe, Central and Southeast Asia, and the Middle East. So they really were a kind of world-renowned company. But you may have noticed that we have been talking about this company, QuaDream, in the past tense, and that is because shortly after we published our research and blog posts on this spyware threat, the company actually filed for bankruptcy. So they are now defunct. One good thing that did come out of this was that even though we couldn't disclose any of the victims, we actually just recently saw an article where QuaDream was named in a lawsuit.
That's right, yeah. A dissident in the United Kingdom, originally from Saudi Arabia by the name of Yahya Assiri, sued the Saudi government for hacking his phone, both with Pegasus and QuaDream. Pegasus sold to Saudi Arabia, QuaDream also reportedly sold to Saudi Arabia.
So now we're going to tell you about some of the reverse engineering that we did on these samples. So before we talk to you about the specific spyware elements that were contained within this sample, I just want to talk about these iOS threats in general. So whenever you're seeing iOS malware, it's a little different from other traditional malware, and part of that is because there's always multiple payloads. So an iOS threat is not going to be one single binary. It is usually multiple binaries that are delivered kind of in succession, and they work in kind of a symphony together to do different things on the device, so they're very hard to capture. And if you do capture, you only capture part of the chain. So what you'll find is in order to do any of these spyware things on a device, there's actually a huge prerequisite for getting root access on the device that is very difficult. And so you have to basically bypass all of these protection mechanisms that Apple has implemented. So as an example, sandboxing and entitlements are a huge mitigation that Apple has implemented that works effectively well. An example of a sandbox would be BlastDoor, but also there's app sandboxes, and that's in order to protect the context and from moving outside of the context that that process is supposed to work in. So normally if you're inside a sandbox, you're not able to escape that sandbox and access any resources outside of your designated resources, and it also protects you from any breakouts of like a PDF breakout or something like that. However, entitlements work in concert with the sandboxing, and this is because there's certain activities on a device that actually require special permissions. So as an example, WeatherKit is tied to location. So there's a certain WeatherKit entitlement that even if you break out of the sandbox and you're using that, if you broke out of the sandbox but you don't have the WeatherKit entitlement, you can't access that particular feature. So entitlements are a very powerful invention by Apple for protecting your devices. Also, code signing and AMP are a huge part of iOS protection, and this makes it very difficult to exploit iOS devices. So you can't just patch some iOS binary and make it do what you want. Because of code signing and AMP, your process will be killed. So normally we'll see exploits running in memory, and so we'll see this later, but they'll like write some kind of dilib to a disk and then load that into process memory in order to execute. You've probably heard of pointer authentication codes or PAC, and PAC is just a way to sign pointers so that ROP and JOP and things like that are not effective as attacks on the device anymore. So there were some capabilities that we saw that were kind of traditional spyware that we'll see, and it was not super impressive, but it is like run-of-the-mill spyware. Anytime you see something like this, you know that it's likely spyware because it's just things that are extracting information about the device itself. So we saw that when the sample started, it would try to query the iOS version, it would look for carrier information, it was trying to get status about the device, so it wanted to know, were you connected to Wi-Fi? What was the access point name? Were you in airplane mode? And then it was doing the traditional spying type activities like recording audio, taking pictures, and tracking location. It also did some things that were specific to this sample that we don't necessarily see in every single iOS exploit. It was exfiltrating and deleting keychain items. It was also deleting other files on disk that we will talk about. And then there was no persistence mechanism. And so it's pretty common in iOS that you will not see a persistence mechanism because the exploits are trying to run in memory. These exploits don't want a persistence mechanism anyway because they want to try and hide their tracks. But it's also very difficult to establish persistence on iOS. And this is due to the iOS secure boot chain. So unlike other platforms and other operating systems, if you try to modify something on iOS, it will not persist upon reboot. And so you actually have to modify all the way down the boot chain. And so the way the boot chain works, going from left to right, the boot ROM will verify the LLB, and then the LLB will verify the iBoot. iBoot will verify kernel, and then the kernel will verify the iOS operating system. And this all rests in the secure enclave verifying these steps as the device boots. So if you want to establish persistence on iOS, you literally have to try and find an exploit and somehow go down all of those preceding levels. So it's incredibly difficult, and so you will rarely ever see this in iOS exploitation. However, there are some examples of persistence or fake persistence that Bill will explain.
Yeah, so as Christine explained, the sort of notion of capital P persistence is very, very tough on iOS. But there are a couple of ways you can kind of, have sort of small p persistence, meaning that the spyware is almost always running when the device is on. and the spyware is not, or the infection itself is not necessarily removed when the device is turned off. So a very rudimentary example of this, but still pretty clever. ZecOps had a blog post looking at, well, what if you just hook the reboot functionality of the device, and you mislead the user into thinking that they've rebooted their device and they actually haven't. Yeah, kind of clever. This is a theoretical attack. Haven't seen this in the wild, but there are a couple of interesting examples we have seen in the wild. So the sample of Pegasus that targeted our friend in the UAE, Ahmed Mansour, back in 2016, had kind of a clever thing that it did. So it identified this binary that was part of the startup sequence of iOS RTBuddyD, which was invoked with an argument -- early boot. I don't actually know what RTBuddyD did, but evidently nothing important, because what the spyware did is it replaced RTBuddyD with the JavaScript core binary. This is a signed, legitimate Apple binary. And of course, when you call JavaScript core, the first argument could be a JavaScript file, which it will then execute. So they put the JavaScript exploit in a file called -- early boot, and that way they invoked the exploit upon reboot and reinfected the device. A competitor to Pegasus in 2021, we saw them use iOS shortcut automations for persistence, which was pretty clever. So shortcut automations are things that you could put on your device to make your life easier, like, when this precondition is met, do this thing. So normally you'll get a notification saying the thing was, the automation was triggered, but the persistence mechanism here also involved installing a configuration profile which suppressed the notification. So there would be no notification that this was going on, but when any of the system apps, like Safari, whatever, were loaded, which invariably happens on reboot, then it would check a number of conditions and then essentially fetch the WebKit exploit invisibly in a WebKit window in the background and reinfect the device. So pretty clever. You also might imagine that when a device boots up, it reads config from disk, and that config might involve some sort of deserialization of complex data. So you could potentially stick a vulnerability in a config, which is read on reboot, and reinfect the device like that. But as Christine mentioned, persistence is really a misfeature if you have a reliable zero-click exploit. You don't need it, right? You just hack the target again when they turn their phone back on. Easy. And you leave fewer traces on the device. One thing that I thought was pretty clever that this sample did that I think would be worth drawing attention to is the way that it subverted two-factor authentication for iCloud. So we've all been in the situation where you go to apple.com or whatever, you sign in, and it's like, oh, you get a pop-up on your iPhone and your Mac and your iPad. It's like, someone in Maui, Hawaii is trying to sign into your iCloud account. Do you want to approve or deny? And so you click approve, and you get the 6-digit code that you have to type into Apple's website. So this is, a fairly simple process conceptually. This is a time-based one-time pad, TOTP, meaning that the 6-digit code is entirely determined by some secret key material as well as the current time. So typically, if you are using a well-understood TOTP implementation, you would just steal the secret key material and boom, you're good. But the process that handles the generation of these codes, add ID on iOS, is, it's obfuscated with Fairplay DRM. It's a little bit annoying, I guess, to reverse. So why would you invest time reversing it? Why work harder when you can work smarter? So what you do is you inject into add ID, and you use function hooking to generate codes in a very clever way. So I'll pass it back over to Christine to explain dial-up injection, how this worked in the sample.
Yeah, so thankfully, Jonathan Levin actually has some POC code for this on his website. And so I'm going to talk about dial-up injection and how it works on the device. So if you want to leverage add ID for function hooking, and this is assuming that you already have root access, so remember all of those persistence or all of those mitigations that Apple implemented, you have already found bypasses for, and now you have root on the device. So you're going to use your root access to grab the PID of add ID and then establish a task port so that you can interact with that process. Then you need to allocate some memory because you're going to be injecting into memory of add ID. So you'll allocate some memory, and then you will write some shell code into that memory space that you have just allocated, and then you will make it executable. So we're writing in memory, and we're not going to be able to patch that binary because remember, amphi. However, you are able to write a dilib onto disk and then call a make a call to DLOpen to load that dilib. And so the way that this works is every single Apple process uses what's called the DYLD shared cache. And so because they're all using this super large shared binary, a pointer to DLOpen is going to be able to be found through the shared cache. So you can just write all of your malicious code to this dilib on disk, and then you have a pointer to DLOpen that's shared. And then you can write a callback function that in your shellcode will have a call to DLOpen. So when that shellcode executes in memory, DLOpen will then open that dilib on disk and then suddenly execute. And so now you are executing with all of the permissions and all of the entitlements that add-ID has, but your code is executing rather than add-ID. And so you can overwrite any function of add-ID that you want.
So as I mentioned earlier, the sort of theory here, right, is TOTP, the SIG code solely determined by secret key material and wall clock time. So again, you don't want to reverse engineer add-ID because it's too hard, right? So what do? Well, you hook. Which function do you hook? You hook get time of day. So you fool add-ID about the current time. So you have arbitrary time inputs to add-ID. The codes are valid for, like 30 or 60 seconds. You can just spam, a ton of different times into add-ID, generate, churn out these two-factor codes valid for arbitrary future times, and yeah, then you've essentially got the two-factor codes that you can use to sign in or do other juicy stuff to the user's iCloud account. So one interesting thing about the sample as well was all of these features that we're talking about. It's not like this stuff would be automatically triggered or run by default when the sample was installed. No, there was a complex predicate language, a declarative language that the operator, the Spyware's operator would configure to say, well, this feature should be used at this time. So what were those prerequisites that could trigger the usage of certain features or exfiltration or monitoring? Well, there were a ton. So changes in VPN or proxy status, whether a third-party jailbreak was detected based on a list of file paths supplied by the operator, whether a device was attached via USB, charging, screen locked, battery percentage, blah, 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 located in certain countries, certain connectivity options, so you could only exfiltrate on mobile data, only exfiltrate on Wi-Fi. If there was some data upload that exceeded a specific threshold within a duration, travel to new country, threatening process, so a process name or a bundle supplied by the operator was detected, and or not or pipe. So you could say like, well, if whatever mobile antivirus is detected, then agent commits suicide and uninstalls itself. So one of the interesting things that we saw, which kind of led us to figure out how the exploit actually functioned to implant the spyware on the device, was we found code in the sample that did cleanup. So a command could be triggered by the operator to do cleanup. So what would this do? 3 steps. First step, open a file called calendar sqlite.db. So this is the SQLite database that drives the iOS calendar app on your phone, installed by default. And it would run a series of queries with a parameter supplied by the CNC. So it would delete from several tables pertaining to events organized by or participated in by a certain email address, which kind of seems a bit interesting, right? Like if you're writing spyware, it's not really standard functionality to delete calendar events for the user. So this struck us as very odd. And then the DB would be vacuumed in the 3rd step. So this kind of led us to look at, is something going on via calendar, right?
And this is how we were able to develop our theory of the exploit, and also highlights how important it is to collaborate, because we found that deletion cleanup code in the sample. So Bill actually went back to the device and was like, well, wait a minute, is there some type of calendar invite that was maybe deleted? And so then we realized that we could actually recover that calendar invite, and that is exactly what we did.
Yep. So for those of you who are familiar with Calendar on iOS, the underlying protocol is something called Icalendar, which is based on CalDAV, which is based on WebDAV. It's sort of like a XML HTTP-based protocol. Now, the invites are transmitted from the iCalendar servers to your phone. They're recorded in the Calendar DB, and they were cleaning up the calendar DB. So we thought, well, okay, maybe we're not going to get juice in the calendar DB, but maybe if we go to the victim's iCloud account and work with them to download from the iCalendar server the actual raw events, maybe we can understand better what was going on. So we did this, and we found some very, very, very curious events right around the time that that subbridge D process had been recorded running in the logs. So why were these curious? Well, the first thing we noticed is that the event had been added or organized 6 months after it ended, which is odd. Like, how many times have you invited someone to an event in the past? If you're unless you're a time traveler, right, you don't do this. So the event had been clearly backdated. And this was key because up until recently, if you invited someone to a backdated event, this would not generate any notification on their phone. There was some logic, if the event is in the past, don't notify the user, but still process it anyway. So this has since changed. But yeah, this was the case back then, which we think might explain the backdating here. The other thing we noticed, right, so look at this calendar invitation, right? You can see, key colon value. This is a set of key value pairs. There's no XML, HTML, nothing in here, right? iCalendar is just a set of key value pairs. But in these two tags here, description and attendee, we have a close and open CData tag. This is a feature of XML. So what was XML doing in our, in the key of these events? What's going on here? So what is CData? Well, it turns out, as I mentioned, iCalendar is built on top of CalDev, which is built on top of WebDev, which is an XML-based protocol. So on the wire, right, between the iCalendar server and your device, there is an XML blob that is transmitted that contains, within a CData tag, the iCalendar key value pairs. So if the attacker, as in this case, embeds the closing and then opening CData tags, they can include essentially arbitrary XML, which hits the phone's XML parser. In other words, normally, right, you can't include XML in an iCalendar event. It just happens to be embedded within XML when it's transmitted. But in this case, you can hit the phone's XML parser with arbitrary XML. So does this really work? Yes, we verified it. If you hook the relevant function with Frida, you can see that CoreDev XML element generator parser did start element namespace URL qualified name attributes. You can see that the tag gets parsed. The attacker included XML gets parsed by libxml2. Are there vulnerabilities in libxml2? Well, from time to time there are various CVEs that could potentially be used for remote code execution. We don't actually know what the vulnerability was in this case, but we were able to verify that yes, the arbitrary XML does hit the phone's XML parser, and the phone's iCalendar parser only sees the valid calendar data and doesn't see the closing CData or opening CData tags. So can we actually test this against a server? Well, it turns out that Apple very helpfully has released on GitHub their old production iCalendar server, and you can download it into VM, build it, play around with it. And it turns out that the server does reject these closing and opening CData tags, but only to the right of the colon, so only in the values. It accepts them, it happily accepts them in keys. So this is great. This matches with what we saw in the invite. Furthermore, because of this weird interaction between the iCalendar and the XML, the iCalendar tag, description, close square bracket, close angle bracket, is a key that can then be updated by the attacker. So they can update the event to remove any XML that is parsed by the phone, which would include things that would exploit the phone's XML parser most likely. And it turns out, yes, this event has been updated once. Excellent. Events start with sequence 0, and this is sequence 1. Okay, so we've got an event that has been updated. It doesn't include it just includes the closing and the opening CData tags, which you can't remove. You can't delete a specific key. You can only update the value of a key. So it looks like, yes, this was a vector that the attacker used to break into the device. So fascinating. No longer is iMessage or the sort of identity service D, Apple push notification services the vector for the attacks. It's actually this weird, bizarre, like XML calendar thing.
So just some quick takeaways to close us out. Collaboration and information sharing is important. We literally would not have figured out this iCalendar attack vector if we had not been working together. We would have never, CitizenLab would have never gotten the idea to literally go back to the device iCloud account and pull down that calendar invite that they did not know had been deleted, and we would have just been like, oh, this is weird, subbridge D, okay, gonna move on to something else. So yeah, this is a really, really interesting thing, so make sure you collaborate with others in the industry. We also wanted to mention that cloud services are a really convenient, amazing vector that's being added by all these software engineers for exploitation. So if you're looking for vulnerabilities, look at cloud services. That being said, if something is really convenient and useful, it's also a new attack vector. So if you are a software engineer, please don't add new vulnerabilities to our devices. The other thing is we want to make sure that we're building the wall broader, not just taller in one place. So BlastDoor is an amazing iMessage protection capability, and we would love to see something like that for iCalendar and other iCloud services as well. So there is lockdown mode, which kind of does that. It builds that really broad wall protecting Apple devices. However, it's not turned on by default. So this is something that is really, really great, but it's a default wall that you will not be protected by if you don't have it turned on.
And if I could just jump in, we have seen cases at CitizenLab in terms of analyzing these zero-click exploits where lockdown mode actually does, in fact, block the exploit. So people who have lockdown mode turned on have received either notifications saying, you know, attacker email is trying to do whatever, or they don't get any notification, but the interaction is blocked from because it's an unknown account. The attacker's account is not added to the user's contacts. And lockdown mode, one of the key features, one of the key theories behind its operation is it blocks complex interaction from non-contact accounts via Apple services.
So that is a wrap. Thank you so much, everyone. We appreciate it.